I have been developing games as a hobby for the last 6 or so years, and in that time, all of my experience has been with Unity, a massive name in the development scene, and a really great, robust engine to work with. And recently I've been working on a new project and video, and it's going really well, so just look out for that one soon. But, if you've seen the news recently, you would have seen Unity's questionable business decisions that are just pushing developers to seek out other platforms that can hopefully replace them. The other big name in the game engine space is Unreal Engine, an engine that's been around for decades and is the foundation of so many games, and it's the feature set for basically anything you can imagine. So why not give it a go? Well, the first thing that puts me off Unreal is my fear of C++. I've made a couple projects in Unreal before, but the fact that I can't work with C++ anywhere near as well as I can with C#, it just means that there's another learning curve to the process, which isn't necessarily bad, but it's still something to consider. And another reason is that according to most reliable sources like Reddit, Unreal isn't the best for 2D games, which is what I usually focus on. So that really doesn't make any sense if it's not suitable. And before I get hated by Unreal users, I know it has a great feature set for 2D, I know it's there, I know what Paper 2D is, and it's definitely fine for what I want if actual professionals can do it. But anyway, moving on. So looking at the other options, one emerging engine that's been framed as a Unity replacement is Godot. Godot is a free, open source alternative that's been highly praised by some indie developers, such as DevDuck here on YouTube, so let's give it a go. What I plan to do today is make a project in Godot, which sounds pretty easy, but I don't know anything about Godot and I've never seen the engine before, so let's get started. I'm going to head to Godot's site and just download the engine. One of the nicest developments with Unity is actually the inclusion of Unity Hub, an amazing manager for all your projects, installs and learning material. Godot doesn't really have this, you just install the exe for the engine, but as this is the open source community driven option for game engines, there are people making these features for them. So I went on GitHub and found a couple of options, but to be honest, these are rather clunky and didn't really offer what I was looking for, so it's just the simple exe for me. When you first open Godot, project list comes up, so I'm going to create a new project, and for this I'm going to try and develop a simple tower defense game using the assets for my current project as a base, so I'm just focusing on the engine itself. So let's get started. The feeling I first got when I opened Godot was such a weird one to me. It gives me such a sense of familiarity with it all, I vaguely understand what's what, but at the same time I have absolutely no clue what I'm doing. I could try and mess about randomly until something happens, but instead let's just hit up the learn section on their website to see what I can do. One of the great things that Godot do is to shout out their community members for their tutorials and documentation. And one of the most prevalent sources of learning material is GD Quest, who have a website and YouTube channel filled with everything needed to get started with Godot. So I'm going to take the time to watch these through to see if I can make any sense of this engine.
One eternity later.
And after trawling through some of the beginner tutorials, I started aimlessly throwing things together until a game appeared. So in Godot, objects are referred to as nodes. The scenes or levels in the game are also just nodes, and are the ones at the top of the hierarchy. And the editor prompts you to create a new scene node on the left here when none exist. So by creating a 2D node, we now have our first level in our Godot career. If I then drag the level sprite into the scene, it'll add it to the hierarchy, and there it is. The first thing I noticed that always happens with pixel art is that its scaling is all wrong because it's using some algorithm that isn't the nearest neighbor, which makes it look blurry and weird. This setting was actually not hard to find at all. In the inspector under texture, there's a filter option, and nearest is in there, so I just set it to that and it's all good. I have no idea how to do this by default though, which is a bit of a pain in the ass, but moving on. In the inspector, I can see settings that I'm used to, like rendering order, which amazingly has Y sorting as a little toggle. It's such a useful feature in 2D games, but I can't see any way to sort with layers like Unity have, so I have no idea. One thing that really confused me is how Godot handles the camera size, which is this blue box you can faintly see in the editor. And by glancing at the tools, I could not figure out how to match the resolution of my sprite to the size of this camera. In Unity, the camera has a projection size, but all I could see on the Godot camera was a zoom, which does achieve a similar result, but it probably isn't the right way to do it. Now that I've got the basic level, it's time to set up nodes for the few objects. When making a new node, the engine gives you these different types that are essentially templates for what the object is. For the goblin, peasant and arrow nodes, I've gone for the character body 2D, which seems to be the best way to go about it. These nodes are designed for moving characters around, so I assume that's the correct choice. A nice feature I have seen in Godot though is you can actually change the type to anything else, so when I find out I've done this all wrong later, I can just fix it. For the sprites, it's actually the same approach that I take in Unity, by having a sprite as a child object that purely stores this sprite and nothing else. Now, onto the programming side of Godot. By default, Godot uses a language called Geeze script. It's sort of its own language that is very similar to Python, with relaxed syntax and basic structure. But as I don't program with Python and clearly don't know Geeze script, this would be an issue. But luckily, there is an alternative, good old C#. What I didn't realise is it's actually a separate version of the editor, so I had to go back to the website to download the .NET version and set up again. Luckily though, Godot's engine is tiny, and this takes seconds to do. Now I've got the .NET version of the editor, I need to set up Visual Studio to make this all work. In Godot, in the editor settings, you can find the options for external text editor and .NET, so here I just set these to Visual Studio. So when I click on a script, it'll open in VS instead of the built-in editor. But VS doesn't actually know Godot's features and won't give you suggestions and autocompletes. So once again, heading to GitHub to get this. I found this online, and once it's installed, Visual Studio actually works nicely, and now I can see what I'm doing. This is the thing with open source programs, it's like, by default, the setup can be a bit daunting and might be missing features, but assuming the community is strong enough, someone has probably contributed plugins and add-ons to fix this, and so that you can tailor the engine to your liking. One of the interesting things about this game engine is that each node can only have one script attached to it, it seems. So unlike Unity, which has the components that can be stacked onto a single object, here the nodes only serve a single purpose, which I guess makes it easier to sort, as you can't make a behemoth object with a whole pile of components on, but at the same time it just means you have a larger hierarchy with complex objects. So what do I need to do for the game? I need to make the goblins follow a predetermined path, I need the peasants to shoot at the goblins as they go by, the player needs to be able to hire peasants, and the base needs to have a health value, so if the goblin reaches the end of the path, the player takes damage. So, let's start with the goblins. One of the default nodes is the character body 2D, which comes with a code base that allows for movement and physics, so I started with that. This class allows for gravity, but as it's a top-down game I don't want this, so I just deleted those lines of code until all I was left with was the unit moving from a vector 2. Currently, this is really the user's input, but I need to change this to the direction of the next node. So I got most of the basic logic for the path and goblin setup. However, I just couldn't wrap my head around how to get a reference to another class in Godot. In a lot of documentation I've seen, you have to give the path directly, which seems kind of weird, but even still, it would just error out with this, so I just kept looking. Eventually, I got it to work by giving the absolute path of the node, being root level pathway, and then using the node as a pathway, which does work, but this node path system just seems a little odd to me. But as you can see, the goblins now follow the path somewhat nicely. At the moment it's just setting their position instead of using physics, so it looks a little janky, but for now it's acceptable. The next learning point is collisions. When an arrow collides with a goblin, I need it to take some health away and destroy the arrow. And when the goblin collides with an invisible trigger at the end of the path, it will do the same to the base's health. Again, this took me a little while to work out, but eventually I found this node tab exists, which led me to the answer I was looking for. In the node tab, it has a list here of signals, which act similarly to events in Unity, where you can assign different functions to be called when the signal is activated. And then the last use of colliders in the game is to trigger the tower's AI to start attacking the goblins when they get in range, which is all handled with a circular collider. If the goblin is within this collider, it must be in range, and the peasant will shoot at it until it's either dead or left the radius. For the area 2D nodes, they contain a signal for body entering and exiting the area, which is exactly what I needed to achieve the trigger system. So for this, I made two functions in the peasant script, onBody enter and onBody exit. When a goblin enters the area, it's added to a list. When it exits, it's removed. Simple. This is all I need for the targeting system, and I just use the distance to function to work out the closest target, and will then use this in the next steps. When the tower is triggered, it needs to rotate to face the target, which is simply done by grabbing a vector 2 of the direction of the goblin from the peasant, and then using the angle property to set the global rotation. And as you can see, when the goblins go by, the crossbows are rotated towards them, ready to attack. I now need to trigger the attacking of the tower, so that it would just be a boolean to say whether or not the tower is looking at an enemy, and if so, start a countdown and attack every time it hits 0. And as I had already set up the arrow's code of simply moving forward and colliding with the goblins, it's just a case of spawning them in the correct rotation at the crossbow's firing point. To do this, you have to create an instance of the object using the instantiate function. The documentation on this was weirdly hard to find, as in GDScript this is instance, and the C# version seemingly used to be called this too, but I eventually found it. To set up an object, you create a new variable from the instance, set the required position and rotation, and then add it as a child. It's a little different to Unity's method, but it's fairly simple. And now, it's just a case of adding the final touches to this little project, such as the enemy spawner, the gold values, and hiring peasants. So I'm going to take some time to add this, and I'll be back to say how it all went. And here we have the final project. Now, I don't see this winning any awards, but it's definitely taught me a good amount about Godot's workflow, and I could definitely see why a lot of developers enjoy using it. So overall, how did this little experiment go? Will I be moving all my projects to Godot from now on? Well, no. While Godot is clearly a great toolkit for developers to make great games, I feel a lot more comfortable in Unity, and its workflow just makes a lot of sense to me. Now obviously this is massively skewed, because 6 years of experience is a lot more than 24 hours, so obviously going to pick Unity. But hey, I like it. Since this whole Unity collapse, I'll still be looking to other engines for certain projects, and when Godot's .NET implementation expands with full platform support, the engine I use for my next project might be a no-brainer. And I hope you liked this little experiment. Make sure you leave a like and a comment down below on your thoughts. What engine do you enjoy using the most and why? It'd be interesting to hear differing opinions, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.